Smith hits a high fly ball to right field. In from right comes Torrey Hunter.
This right here is the last time Detroit sports fans felt real joy. The joy you can only get as a sports fan from watching your favorite team advance in the playoffs. But since that time, not only has it been heartbreak and mediocrity for the Detroit Tigers, it's been that way for every pro team in Detroit. So let's look back at what may be the worst decade for a sports city in American sports history.
Totally Sportsesque. Major League.
After the Pistons moved from Fort Wayne to Detroit in 1957, the city officially had at least one team in the 4 major sports leagues, joining New York City as the only other city to do so. 2 decades before this, Detroit was nicknamed the City of Champions, and this mainly stems from the fact that Detroit remains the only city to win 3 major championships within 1 year. And from the time the city received that nickname to now, Detroit teams have won 21 championships, which ranks them 5th in the US. But instead of looking back at the glory days, we're here to talk about what went wrong over the past decade. In spite of the way the decade ended, Detroit sports were in pretty good shape at the start of the 2010s. The same week the Tigers defeated the Yankees in the 2011 ALDS, the Lions improved to 5-0. The Red Wings began their season that would result in their 21st straight postseason appearance, and the NBA was in the midst of a lockout, which meant the Pistons were undefeated. Though the Tigers would lose in the ALCS, the Lions and Red Wings would lose in the playoffs, and the Pistons would try, the future for Detroit sports looked promising. While the Red Wings lost Nicholas Lidstrom, the Tigers added Prince Fielder and emerged as one of the favorites to win the pennant. The Lions had a generational talent they were ready to waste, and the Pistons were ready to build around their first-round pick, Andre Drummond. It seemed certain that Mickey Lolich and Detroit sports fans would see at least one title in the next few years, but spoiler alert, they didn't. The Tigers did win the AL pennant in their first year with Prince Fielder, but just like in 2006, the break between the ALCS and the World Series, caused by a 7-game series in the NLCS, had an effect, and in 2012 led to a sweep. But it wasn't all over for the Tigers. They added Torrey Hunter and re-signed Justin Verlander. Max Scherzer would emerge as a Cy Young winner, and for the 3rd year in a row, the Tigers were in the ALCS. After a near no-hitter in Game 1, things looked very promising for the Tigers going into the bottom of the 8th with a 4-run lead. It looked like they were going to take the first 2 games on the road and head back home with Verlander on the mound. But then, Joaquin Benoit came out of the bullpen and David Ortiz stepped up to the plate. And if there's a visual representation of the Tigers and Detroit sports in this time, it's this play. David Ortiz would tie the game with a grand slam. The Red Sox would win the game and go on to win the series, and the Tigers' victory in Game 4 of the series would be the last Tigers playoff victory. As the following year, they were swept in the ALDS against the Orioles, and haven't reached the playoffs since. And the early 2010s Tigers not winning a World Series with a team that featured 5 future or past Cy Young winners, a Triple Crown winner, and the likes of Prince Fielder, Torrey Hunter, and Ian Kinsler is rather astonishing. And the perfect start and representation of this decade of pain for Detroit fans. And while the Tigers' hopes of a championship in this period were dashed after 2014, Detroit sports fans had a glimmer of hope radiating from their long-standing abusive relationship with the Lions. The Lions had their best regular season since 1991 and 2014, which led them to a wild-card matchup against the only team they've ever beat in the playoffs during the Super Bowl era, the Dallas Cowboys. And if there's one moment for Detroit sports during this time, where it all went straight downhill for everyone, then it can be found on a pass made to Brandon Pettigrew by Matthew Stafford with 8:25 left to go in the 4th quarter of this game. The refs initially called defensive pass interference on this play, but after announcing the penalty to the crowd and getting an earful from a helmetless Des Bryant, the refs suddenly reversed the call, causing the Lions to punt and completely change the trajectory of the game. The Cowboys would of course go on to win the game, and any chance of this incredibly talented young Lions team making a run were gone. The Lions would have a few more good seasons by their standards under Jim Caldwell, but like many things involving the Detroit Lions, it would end in disappointment. They would lose Ndamukong Suh after the 2014 season, and just like Barry Sanders, Calvin Johnson would retire earlier than expected. The Lions would make what many consider a mistake by firing Jim Caldwell and hiring Matt Patricia, who would have the 3rd worst win percentage of any Lions head coach in their history, who coached at least 3 seasons. And the same time the Lions went back into the dumpster fire, the rest of the Detroit sports teams joined them. The same year Jim Caldwell was fired by the Lions, the Red Wings' 25 consecutive playoff appearance streak came to an end, and they have not finished a season over 500 since. The Pistons went to the playoffs in 2016 and 2019, but both ended in sweeps, which extended their playoff losing streak to 14, an NBA record and the third longest playoff losing streak in American sports history. And as for the Tigers, after being swept in 2014, just like the Pistons, they have had only one season where they finished over 500. And if we look at Detroit sports as a whole, since the last time a team won a playoff game, which was the Red Wings in 2016, in the 28 seasons since that time, only 4 times did teams finish over 500, with 3 of those being from the Lions. And combined, the 4 teams finished 432 games under 500. In a study by theanalyst.com in 2021, they found the top 10 worst winning percentages in a sports year for metro areas with 4 teams. And Detroit led the way by making up 3 of the top 10 spots, with 2 of those being in consecutive years. So it's not an exaggeration to say Detroit sports has been through the worst period in American sports history. And I call this a decade of pain because from 2012 to 2022, Detroit sports fans experienced almost every heartbreak imaginable. To recap, they watched a team with arguably one of the greatest rotations of all time, along with prime Miguel Cabrera and Prince Fielder, fail to win a championship, then go on to have the 3rd worst record of the 21st century in 2019. They watched the team that has been the best of them have their playoff streak come to an end, then go on to tie the franchise record for a playoff drought. They watched a promising young Lions team with a generational talent in Calvin Johnson fail to win a playoff game, then implode, causing Calvin Johnson to retire early and bring along the tenure of Matt Patricia. And they also watched the Pistons try to build around Andre Drummond, trade for Blake Griffin, and go on to also win 0 playoff games to build on their record playoff losing streak. And to add to the pain in all of this, fans have watched so many players leave Detroit then go on to win a championship. Of course, everyone knows that Matthew Stafford left and won a Super Bowl with the Rams, but aside from Stafford, players such as JD Martinez, Chris Middleton, Kyle Van Noy, and Darren Helm all won titles after leaving Detroit. And that 2014 5-man rotation the Tigers rolled out all would go on to win the World Series with another team within the next 5 years. And you could add Drew Smiley to the mix if you wanted to. But given this historic run of losses, an interesting question to ask is, would you rather have all your favorite teams finish in the bottom tier at the same time like Detroit? Or would you rather have a few of your favorite teams compete every year but never win it all like Minnesota teams recently? While Detroit teams have only made the playoffs twice since 2016, Minnesota teams have made the playoffs 15 times and only advanced twice. And that includes the Twins, who increased their playoff losing streak to 18, which is the all-time record in American sports. And another record they are currently tied for with Buffalo is 117 seasons without a championship. And it should be mentioned that Buffalo has 2 less teams than Minnesota, and Minnesota has covered the ground in 26 less years. Going back to the question, me personally, I would rather have my favorite teams compete because even though heartbreak would seem inevitable, there would be something to look forward to. And just like Detroit teams in the early part of the decade, there were still some memorable moments despite the final outcomes. And while Detroit sports teams have struggled at a historic rate lately, and been on seemingly never-ending rebuilds even though owners have claimed these rebuilds are over, the future for Detroit sports almost has to look bright. While the Tigers' young core clearly hasn't reached their potential yet, they still have plenty of time to turn things around, and have the luxury of currently playing in the worst division in baseball. The Red Wings just had their best season since their last playoff appearance, and many see Steve Yzerman setting them up for success in the long term. The Pistons lost out on Victor Wembanyama, but added Asar Thompson to their group of young players that includes Cade Cunningham. And if there is one team Detroit sports fans can be excited for, it's the Lions. With Dan Campbell leading the way, the Lions look like the only team in Detroit not in a rebuild. With Aaron Rodgers gone, the Lions are currently the favorites to win their division. and are even opening up the season in prime time against the Chiefs. So while the last decade has brought great pain for Detroit sports fans, it's only right that this next decade could be a time of glory for the Motor City. But as any non-spoiled sports fan will tell you, don't get your hopes up too high.
Doesn't matter if you have one ass cheek and 3 toes, I will beat your ass.